Okay, let's finish up our discussion of the biological bases of mind and behavior with particular attention to the structures of the brain that makes thinking and everything else possible. Last time I described 4 examples of so-called localization of function, the idea that particular mental and behavioral functions are associated with or are performed by particular parts of the brain. And I pointed out that here in the frontal lobe, we have an area that's devoted to voluntary motor behavior that controls the movements of the hands and the arms, the legs, the feet, the various parts of the body. Here in parietal cortex, we have the so-called somatosensory area, which receives sensory impulses from various parts of the body, especially the skin, the sense of touch. Here in the temporal lobe, we have what's known as the primary auditory projection area, which receives auditory messages from the ears. And then finally, back here, we have the primary visual cortex, which receives sensory messages from the eyes. Just in passing, I want to point out that there's a kind of substructure here that's interesting. We've already talked a little bit about differentiation of function within the frontal motor cortex and the parietal somatosensory cortex in terms of the motor and sensory homunculus, the little man in the head that shows where all these little areas are located. But again, you don't have to memorize this, but you should just know that even within the occipital lobe, there is quite a bit of specialization of function, so that we have different areas of visual cortex that are devoted to things like the processing of color information, the processing of movement information, and so on. You're not responsible for this. I'm just trying to show you how the thing is built. The study of stroke patients also reveals certain areas of the brain that are specialized for speech and language. We know this because aphasia, a disruption of normal speech and language functions, is a very common symptom that patients experience following stroke. The symptoms of aphasia, language disorder, vary greatly. They can just be speech disfluencies, where the intended words just don't come out right, or there's a lot of labor to the speech. Problems with meaning. Aphasic patients will have difficulty repeating words and phrases that are spoken to them. They'll have difficulty understanding spoken words. They have difficulty naming objects. And sometimes they have difficulty with reading and writing as well as with speaking. But when we talk about aphasia, we're usually talking about speech problems. And it turns out there are a wide variety of different kinds of aphasia, but the 2 that are of most interest to us at this level of the course were identified in the 19th century, first by a neurologist named Broca, so-called expressive aphasia, and second by a German neurologist named Wernicke, so-called receptive aphasia. In Broca's aphasia, the patient's speech shows a lot of disfluencies. The patient is just not speaking normally the way most people do, but the speech is slow, it's ungrammatical, it's labored, it's inarticulate, words don't quite come out right, words don't get fit together in sentences quite the way they should. However, the patient's comprehension of the speech of others is perfectly fine. Okay? The person is having a difficulty getting speech out, but isn't having any difficulty understanding the speech of others, so that the person can respond to commands and things like that perfectly normally. They don't seem to have any of these kinds of problems. On the other hand, patients with Wernicke's aphasia, a so-called receptive aphasia, not only have problems with speech production or speech expression, but they also have problems understanding the speech of other individuals. They can't follow commands, they can't follow instructions because they simply seem not to be able to understand what other people are saying to them. Moreover, patients with Wernicke's aphasia, so-called receptive aphasia, also have expressive problems, but their expressive problems are different from those that we observe in so-called Broca's aphasia. In Broca's aphasia, patients have a lot of difficulty speaking, but when they speak, their speech makes sense. You can understand what it's all about. It might be hard, but you can kind of get the meaning that they're trying to convey. By contrast, in Wernicke's aphasia, the person's speech may be very fluent in some abstract sense. All the words come out fine, all the speech comes out fine, but it doesn't mean anything. So again, there's a problem with producing meaning as well as understanding the meaning of the speech of others. In either case, there's no damage to the corresponding skeletal musculature. The speech apparatus is fine, for example. The hearing pathways are fine. Clearly, the difficulty resides somewhere in the central nervous system. And we've known since the middle part of the 19th century that, in fact, these two forms of aphasia, these two particular forms of language dysfunction, are associated with damage to two different parts of the brain. Broca's aphasia, the expressive aphasia, where the person has difficulty speaking, but the speech makes sense, is associated with damage in a portion of the frontal lobe right here, known as Broca's area, because he discovered it, Broca's area, which lies just adjacent to the motor cortex of the frontal lobe. So Broca's aphasia, an expressive aphasia, is associated with damage in areas adjacent to the motor cortex. By the same token, Wernicke's aphasia, the so-called receptive aphasia, where the patient has difficulty conveying meaning and has difficulty understanding the speech of others, is associated with damage in an area known as Wernicke's area, which is located in this region, mostly up here in the temporal lobe, maybe extending a little bit into the parietal lobe. Two different areas, when damaged, produce two different forms of speech dysfunction. Sometimes we think of Broca's area as a speech area, and we think of Wernicke's area as a language area. It's not exact, that's not quite right, but it's pretty close. Notice, just to make the point, notice where Broca's area is, okay? It's right down here, very close to the lateral fissure. And if you remember our little homunculus, our little man in the head, and you look at the motor cortex here in the frontal lobe, you'll notice that the areas of the frontal primary motor cortex that control the movement of the face, the lips, the jaw, and the tongue are right here, again, very, very, very close to the lateral fissure. So when you, again, look at, when you look at where Broca's area is, it kind of makes sense. This is an area of speech that projects into precisely those portions of motor cortex that control the speech apparatus. Okay, so damage here. It's no wonder people have difficulty speaking. In fact, if you look at it from a somewhat broader perspective, you can see that speech and language functions actually requires the coordination of a number of different centers. Here are the pathways, for example, that are involved in speaking a word that is spoken to the patient. First, the word has to be received by the primary auditory area, okay? Then the information is transmitted to Wernicke's area, which tries to understand the word. Then the intention to speak that word is transmitted to Broca's area, which organizes the speech apparatus, and then passes information to the those portions of the primary motor cortex that control the speech apparatus. So here we have 1, 2, 3, 4 different areas that are involved in repeating what is said to the patient. Similarly, if you want a person to speak a written word, the visual input is first processed in the primary visual area, then information is passed to Wernicke's area, which has, at least in part, the job of understanding what's being read, then passed to Broca's area, which organizes the speech, and then to the appropriate areas of the motor cortex, which actually executes the speech act. These different centers show you, illustrate a point I'm going to make a little bit later on, which is that it's not right to think about the brain as a whole bunch of independent machines or organs, each going off on their own, performing their own little functions. Most complicated forms of human thought and action require the coordination, the integration of a number of different brain areas. So again, this is just an illustration of how a number of different brain areas work together to perform even so simple a piece of behavior as repeating a spoken word or repeating a written word. Okay, so now we've got Broca's area and Wernicke's area added to the motor cortex, the somatosensory cortex, the primary auditory area, and the primary, the visual area. What's the rest of the brain doing? Well, for a long time, these other areas of the brain, the vast bulk of the frontal lobe and the vast bulk of the temporal, parietal, and occipital lobes, were simply called association areas. And the general idea was that these very large portions of the brain had the function of integrating sensory inputs and performing memory and thought processes, kinds of processes that are involved in learning and memory and thinking and language and so on. There was at one point the idea that maybe there was some specialization back here, that the posterior association cortex, that is, the association cortex that lies behind the central fissure, was basically geared for perceptual integration, that it could take tactile and auditory and visual information and kind of put it all together, whereas the frontal association area, that is, the part that lies in front of the central fissure, was basically involved with problem solving. We've already seen that prefrontal cortex, right up here, is something that is very, very, very well developed in humans. But the notion of association area is a little bit misleading, because we now know that there are portions of so-called association cortex that are also dedicated to particular kinds of mental functions. So, for example, there are lots of different neurological symptoms that we can observe resulting from brain damage. We've talked about amnesia, the problem of memory, as in the case of patient HM. We've talked about aphasia, speech problems, as in Broca's aphasia and Wernicke's aphasia. But some patients after brain damage will show alexia, they'll have difficulty in reading. Agraphia, they'll have difficulty in writing. Acalculia, they'll have difficulty with arithmetic and other mathematical functions. Apraxia, where they'll have difficulty engaging in various kinds of actions. They can understand what they're being asked to do, but if you say to somebody, grab the pen, they can't seem to execute that particular behavior. Or a symptom known as agnosia, which is a lack of access to various kinds of knowledge. They can't identify objects that ought to be familiar to them, identify what they're for. It turns out that each of these symptoms more or less, is associated with damage to a different part of the brain, okay? Or these symptoms may arise from damage to a couple of different but particular parts of the brain, suggesting that there's a lot more going on in so-called association cortex than simply forming associations, that there's a lot more functional specialization in the brain than simply the primary sensory areas and the various kinds of language areas. In fact, now we believe that there is so much functional specialization in different parts of the brain that cognitive psychology and cognitive neuroscience has adopted what might be called a doctrine of modularity. The idea that different so-called higher mental functions, not just elementary mental functions like thinking, but like hearing and the seeing, different mental functions are served by different so-called mental organs. You can think about the mind as being divided up into specialized organs, and you can think of each of these specialized mental organs as associated with a different part of the brain. This is a theory of neural organization that was proposed by Jerry Fodor, a philosopher of psychology and linguist. Used to be at MIT, now he's at Rutgers. And Fodor argued that these modules, these specialized mental modules, had particular set of properties. First is that they are domain-specific, which is to say that each mental module processes only a certain class of inputs. Fodor suggested that there were modules dedicated to processing language, different module dedicated to processing visual inputs, different module dedicated to auditory perception, like for the perception of music or whatever. And then each of these modules would provide an output, maybe to some kind of central executive. But the idea that there are different modules for different domains of information processing, different modules for different domains of human activity. Second phenomenon, the second property of these mental modules is that they are what Fodor called informationally encapsulated, which means they take only what's given to them by some kind of input mechanism, and there isn't any input from other domains. You're going to see an example of this in our lectures on sensation and perception, where I'll show you some visual illusions where things don't look the way they are. That the visual percept is not an accurate representation of reality. But then when you know that, when you know this is the Ponzo illusion or this is the Poggendorf illusion or whatever, you still see the illusion. Knowing that you're seeing something wrong doesn't correct things. That's because these visual illusions are created by the activity of dedicated mental modules that are dedicated to visual processing, and knowledge from residing elsewhere in the system can't get in to affect their operations. The third property of these mental modules is that they are what Fodor called hardwired. And what he meant by that was that these mental modules are not assembled from more elementary functions. They are themselves the basic units of psychological function, okay? So they kind of stand alone in that sense. Another property is that, at least hypothetically, they are innate. That is, they come with the organism as part of its basic information processing equipment. You don't learn to see visual illusions the way you see them. You don't really learn to use language the way you learn to use language. You use language the way you do because your brain's built to do language. You see the world the way you do because your brain is just built innately to see the world that way. Another property is that these mental modules operate automatically. They can't help but do what they do. Okay? There's no switch you can flip to turn them on or off. Whenever they get an input, they do what they're supposed to do and then create an output for some other part of the system. And then finally, most important for our purposes, Fodor suggested that each of these mental modules was associated with a fixed neural architecture, meaning each of these mental modules was associated with a particular locus in the brain, a particular piece of the brain performed each one of these functions. Now, this doctrine of modularity is now very, very popular in psychology and cognitive neuroscience, and there's a lot to it. It is the dominant view of brain organization these days, so that you can, this is from the New York Times a couple of years ago, it's as good an illustration as any of what's going on. The result of studies of brain behavior function reveal a map of specialization of function, or cerebral localization, that has some of the features of the old phrenologist map, but very, very different functions located in very, very different areas. Just by comparison, this is the old phrenologist map. I discussed this last time. Wrong, okay? But here is a view of functional specialization as of just a couple of years ago, where here is a part of the brain that does approximate mathematical operations. If I ask you to guess what 23 times 58 is, you say, oh, yeah, a couple thousand, okay? That part of the brain, right here is what performs that. Here's another part of the brain that's involved in the anticipation of pain. Here's another part of the brain that's involved in a pleasant sense of touch. Here's a part of the brain that performs exact mathematical calculations, where you sit down and say, 23 times 57, okay, carry the 1, move the 5 over, all that stuff that you do when you multiply, that is apparently being performed by a part of the prefrontal cortex right here. Here is a part of the visual cortex that's dedicated to the perception of speed. Here is another part of the visual cortex that's dedicated to the perception of motion. Here is a part of the visual cortex, actually right here in the junction between the temporal lobe and the parietal lobe, that's involved in face recognition. I don't want you to memorize all these locations, okay? That's for another class. But what I do want you to get a sense of is that now the brain, which we had once thought was just this huge kind of monolithic organ that sat on top of the spinal cord, is now really a collection of dedicated organs, each of which is dedicated to performing a particular psychological function. And if you open randomly any major scientific journal, Nature, Science, Brain, Cortex, whatever, every month you'll see somebody reporting what they believe is the discovery of a new center in the brain that is dedicated to some particular mental function. Okay? So this is the kind of thing that we're now developing, a long way from an undifferentiated piece of tissue. Okay? The brain turns out to be an integrated collection of mental modules, each of which is performing is engaged in a particular kind of mental activity. Where do these mental modules come from? Well, so far as we can figure out, they are apparently a product of evolution. Okay? Usually we think about evolution as operating on body morphology, on the appearance of the body. Fish evolve fins, mammals evolve arms and legs, birds evolve wings, Darwin's finches evolve different kinds of beaks depending on the island in the Galapagos chain that they live on. But it turns out that evolution doesn't just shape the body. Evolution also shapes the brain, and evolution also shapes mind and behavior. The general idea is that these different specializations, a module that processes the speed of motion, a module that processes approximate mathematical computations or whatever, these constitute a kind of mental toolbox which aided our adaptation to the environment as we were splitting off from our hominid ancestors, and especially that these particular mental structures emerged in what the evolutionary psychologists call the environment of early adaptation. That is, the environment where humans first began to emerge in the East African savanna, beginning about almost 2 million years ago. Okay? So that's the general idea behind functional specialization, modularity of the mind consisting of a toolbox of specialized implements, if you will, each of which has been shaped by evolution. And that's as far as, that's all good as far as it can go, but if you think about it for a second, there have to be some limitations on modularity. The idea that the brain is just a toolbox of specialized tools can't be the full story. For one thing, the brain isn't just a collection of independent pieces, each dedicated to a particular function. The first thing we want to do is to distinguish between psychological functions, various kinds of operations of the mind, and the contents to which these operations are applied. Mental functions, mathematical computations, perceiving speed, perceiving motion, all those kinds of things, may very well be localized, may be performed by particular pieces of the brain. But as far as we can tell, mental contents, what you're thinking about when you think, what you perceive when you see something, the precise thing that you remember when you remember some event in your past, those do not appear to be localized. Our knowledge of particular things, particular memories of past events, they appear to be distributed widely over the cerebral cortex, so that they're not particular memories, like what you had for dinner last Thursday, or what your grandmother told you on your high school graduation. Those memories are not localized in particular bundles of neurons. Those memories are represented as a pattern of neural activity that is distributed widely over the cortex. Okay, so the first limitation on the doctrine of modularity is that the doctrine of modularity may apply to functions, but it doesn't seem to apply to content. Okay? It may apply to how you think, but it doesn't necessarily apply to what you think about. The second limitation on the doctrine of modularity, illustrated earlier, and that is that there's a counterposed doctrine of holism, which is to say that in the ordinary course of everyday living, our experience, thought, and action is mediated by the integrated and coordinated activity of a number of different modules. Think about that example that we used before about speaking a written word or speaking a spoken word. How there's not a speaking a spoken word module in the brain, right? Some piece of the brain that just does that and doesn't do anything else. Rather, even that very simple piece of behavior is mediated by the coordinated and integrated actions of at least 4 different mental modules. One that's involved in hearing, one that's involved in understanding, one that's involved in organizing speech, and one that's involved in executing speech. So again, there's that kind of limitation on modularity. A third limitation on modularity comes in the form of what the neuroscientists call equipotentiality. The adult brain may be highly specialized, but the immature brain seems to have a lot more ability to carry out different functions in different parts of the brain. There is what we call plasticity in brain development, and we know this, for example, because children who may have suffered a stroke, little kids can suffer strokes, that doesn't happen very often, but it does happen. Little kids who suffer strokes can recover language function much better than adults who suffer strokes. And apparently this is because there are a number of different centers in the brain that can perform various language functions. And if you destroy one early enough in development, there's the possibility that some other module can take over that function. So early in development, several different areas seem to be capable of carrying out particular functions. And functional specialization appears to get fixed as the brain matures. And the brain doesn't finish developing until well after birth, well into the teenage years at least, at which point the brain loses some degree of plasticity, so that if you're an adult, you suffer brain damage, you may lose some function, and you may have a lot of difficulty recovering from that function. But even in the case of adults, there is some possibility of recovery of function, okay? Again, I used the example the other day of Senator Tim Johnson of North Dakota, who suffered a massive brain hemorrhage, lost his speech function, lost basically his function on the right side of his body, what's known as a right hemiplegia. Over the last 8-9 months, Johnson has recovered a great deal of his speech function. Okay? He's never going to be William Jennings Bryan on the Senate floor, as he himself admits, but his speech is pretty good, if you heard him the other day on the news when he returned to the Senate. And that suggests that even in the adult brain, there is some degree of redundancy, so that at least under some conditions, if you suffer damage to some part of the brain, the function performed by that part of the brain is not necessarily irretrievably lost, because some other part of the brain may have the ability to take over that function. May not perform it perfectly, but will do pretty well. So again, I want you to understand that the doctrine of modularity is the leading understanding of how brain behavior relations, mind-brain relations are organized. But modularity is not the whole story. There are various kinds of limits on modularity. Another reason to doubt an extreme version of the doctrine of modularity is that human beings didn't stay in the environment of early adaptation. Yes, human species emerged in the African savanna some 180,000 years ago, but very quickly we began to move out of the savanna to other environments, out to South Asia and Australia, into the Middle East and East Asia, up into Europe, and then over the land bridge into North and South America. As humans migrated to these new parts of the planet, we moved into very different environments from the environment of early adaptation. And now, of course, we're living in incredibly different environments. Here's Scott Station at the South Pole. Here is the International Space Station, where we have human beings living more or less permanently in environments that are as different from the environment of early adaptation as night is from day. The very fact that we're able to survive the way we survive in Italy and Norway and Iceland, as well as on the African savanna, must be attributable to the fact that we've got more than simply a toolbox that evolved to help us meet the demands of the environment of early adaptation. In addition to this box of dedicated mental tools, we also must have something like general intelligence, a general problem-solving capacity, a general capacity to meet and solve new problems that are posed to us by the new environments to which we move. And we also have to have a capacity for learning. We can't rely simply on innate mental modules in order to get along, in order to survive in new environments, in order to adapt the environments that we encounter to us. We have to be able to acquire new knowledge. And we do that by virtue of a process that we're going to discuss next time, called learning, by which we can acquire new knowledge through experience. Okay, before I do anything else, any questions about the doctrine of modularity and functional specialization and all of that? Anything at all? Yes. Is there any kind of hierarchy about the organization of these modules? Well, you'd think there would be, okay? But so far, that appears not to have been a function, a topic of much research. What cognitive psychology and cognitive neuroscience has been after mostly these days has been to identify what these modules are and what they do, okay? The general idea behind, the general method in cognitive neuroscience is to put somebody in, say, a MRI machine and watch their brain while they perform some particular function in hopes of identifying the particular part of the brain that does that thing, okay? Assembling all of these modules into a kind of hierarchical organization, yeah, there has to be something like that. But there hasn't been that much attention paid to that organizational level. I think that's work that really has to be done in the future. Is that an answer? Okay, yes. Yeah, well, the idea is that these modules evolved in the environment of early adaptation. And in the same way that our physical features evolved in that environment, helping us to survive in that environment, the idea is that our mental features also evolved in that environment to help us survive in that particular environment. And if you read in evolutionary psychology, you will sometimes see theorists write about, well, there are certain kinds of mistakes we make. I'm going to talk about some of these in the lectures on thought and language. And the reason we make them is because our brains evolved in a particular environment, and now we're in a different environment, and we still are using these holdover tools. So these modules did evolve early on. Think about the modules for speech and language, for example. Have to have evolved very, very, very early in the environment of early adaptation. But the point is, we don't live there anymore, okay? Or at least not all of us live there anymore. And the fact that we can live in Norway and Iceland and in outer space and in Antarctica and other places other than that environment must mean that there's something else going on, okay? And what that other thing is, I think, is first, we not only got a set of specialized mental tools, but we have general intelligence. We have a general problem-solving ability that we can use to attack new problems that we encounter. And not only do we have an innately specified mental toolbox, as the doctrine of modularity says, we also appear to have the capacity to learn new things, things that nobody knew anything about in the Pleistocene era in the African savanna, like how to drive a standard shift car. Take an example at random. You had a question, I think? Yes. Right. Look at your brain. That's where you find memory. Question is, where do we find memory? Okay? Particular memories of what you had for dinner last Thursday night, or what your grandmother said to you at high school graduation, or whatever, they don't appear to be located in discrete bundles of neurons the way, say, there's a Broca's area that does speech, or a Wernicke's area that does language. We know that. I got time to do this. We know that based on some classic work by a psychologist at Harvard University named Carl Lashley back in the 1930s. And what Lashley did, it's not for the squeamish, but the experiment was a very simple, straightforward experiment. He would take laboratory animals, these were cats, okay, and they'd be naive cats. They're just kind of raised in the laboratory, never had much opportunity to learn anything, and he'd teach them something. He'd teach them how to open a door to get out of a cage, or he'd teach them how to press a bar to get food, or he'd teach them to run a maze or something like that. And that's all he'd teach them. And he had the idea that by a variant on the lesion method of study, he might be able to find where that piece of learning was located in the brain. So what he did was, after he taught the animals to perform this task, he then lesioned their brains. He would take out various parts of the cerebral cortex, various amounts in various areas, and then let them heal, and then retest them to see if they could still perform the task. And what Lashley discovered was that loss of function, loss of ability to perform the task, was correlated with the amount of tissue that he removed from the brain. But it wasn't correlated with any particular locus. So it's not as if he took out the parietal lobe, the animals lost what they had learned. Or if he took out the frontal lobe, the animals lost what they learned. The amount of tissue mattered, but not the precise location. And that led Lashley to formulate what he called the law of mass action. Law of mass action. Sounds like something you do at a political demonstration, right? But what the law of mass action basically meant was that in learning, you use your whole cortex, okay? That learning is stored in the cortex as a whole. Now, clearly, the animals had to navigate visually through the maze, and so the visual area of the occipital cortex would be important. But as long as you spared that and spared some other cortex, they seemed to be able to perform particularly well. And that led him to conclude that particular things we know aren't localized in particular parts of the brain, but rather are represented in the brain as a whole. Okay, that's the idea. Those of you who are interested in engineering, you know what a hologram is. Lashley didn't know anything about holograms. They're a more recent invention. But a hologram is a representation where you can take an awful lot out of it, and you can still preserve the information in the representation. And he thought that the brain kind of functioned like that. I have a question here. Well, there are the idea, what does it have to do with Broca and Wernicke? The idea is that Broca's area evolved to manage speech, and Wernicke's area evolved to manage language. And if you go back to the modular map here, the general idea is that each of these dedicated areas of the brain evolved in such a way as to perform that function. And the only point is that there's got to be more to brain than that, because we can do things other than these things. We can address the demands of environments other than the one in which we evolved. There's really been no evolutionary change in humans since Adam and Eve. A couple of genes here and there, right? But we're very different from the people of 5, 6, 10, 12,000 years ago. And those differences come by virtue of the fact that we have general intelligence, not just a bunch of dedicated tools, and the ability to learn. We're not relying simply on innate functions. Is that okay? Okay. Anything else about this? Yes. Well, the general idea is that at some point, somewhere in adolescence, the brain becomes more or less fixed in its architecture, and then it's very difficult for some kind of recovery of function. But it's not impossible. Again, I mean, Senator Johnson lost his speech functions, right? They were just gone. That part of his cortex is pretty much finished, right? But he can speak okay, you know. So there's got to be some possibility. Now, exactly what it is isn't completely clear. Remember that the speech and language functions tend to be localized in the left hemisphere, but there's reason for thinking that there are redundant structures in the right hemisphere that we don't usually use, and that maybe they can take over some of these functions if the left hemisphere structures are lost. Moreover, in neuroscience, there used to be a doctrine that said there's no recovery from central nervous system damage. Okay, central nervous system damage is forever. We now know that there is some possibility of neurogenesis in central nervous system tissue. If you damage peripheral nerve tissue, that repairs itself. If you damage central nervous system tissue, the general idea has been that that's gone forever, okay? Now again, you don't want to push this too much. Don't go off riding your motorcycle without a helmet tonight because there's neurogenesis, okay? But apparently the brain, the spinal cord, have some capacity to repair themselves under very, very, very restricted conditions. So there are lots of reasons, okay? Another reason for recovery of function is that the damage may be severe but not complete, okay? So there's just enough tissue left over to be able to perform function at some level. So again, there is the ability to recover some functions, but the younger you are when you have the damage, the more likely you are to experience that kind of recovery. Anything else? We got a couple of minutes here. Yes. Well, equipotentiality, what's the difference between equipotentiality and recovery of function? Equipotentiality really refers to the fact that the immature brain is not yet rigidly specialized, okay? And because the immature brain is not rigidly specialized, there's more ability for an immature brain to recover function than for a mature brain to recover function. Because an immature brain, not being rigidly specialized yet, maybe some other part can take over the function that would otherwise be lost. That's the general idea there. Okay, next time we'll take up processes of learning. Thank you very much. See you Wednesday.